Okay, what happened last chapter?
Um, was it they moved the painting upstairs
Yeah, I think so.
and then like he was kind of like reliving what is that, kind of reminiscing his youth in that room that he was gonna hide his painting in.
Yeah.
And then oh, it was kind of like a long monologue thought process he was going through.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a was it about a book
Yeah, it
that
was that Henry got for him.
he was kind of like sharing. I guess it almost seemed like he was trying to distract himself by um hanging out with Henry.
Mm. Try not to think
And it,
about the portrait and what it could mean.
yeah. hmm
Mm.
and it like worked out because he was able to receive a book from Henry and then talk about it at dinner or something, lunch.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then, oh, I'm kind of mixing up. I think I'm mixing up the time frame, but he did meet with Basil right at one point.
Yes, I believe that was before. I think that was chapter 9.
Okay,
Yeah, I think that was chapter 9. Okay,
okay.
chapter 11.
11 is the X, and then the
Yeah, X and Y.
I. Okay, think it. All right. I oh, I shall start.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 11. For years, Dorian Gray could not free himself from the influence of this book. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he never sought to free himself. He procured it from Paris no less than 9 large paper copies of the first edition, and had bound them in different colors so that they might suit his various moods, and the changing fancies of a nature over which he seemed at times to have almost entirely lost control. Hero, the wonderful young Parisian, in whom the romantic and the scientific temperament were so strangely blended, became to him a kind of prefiguring type of himself. And indeed the whole well, and indeed the whole book seemed to him to contain the story of his own life, written before he had lived it. In one point he was fortunate that the novel's fantastic hero he never indeed had any cause to know that somewhat grotesque dread of mirrors and polished metal surfaces, and still water, which came upon the young Parisian so early in his life, was occasioned by the sudden decay of a bow that had once apparently been so remarkable. It was within an almost cruel joy, and perhaps in nearly every joy, as certainly in every pleasure, cruelty has its place. Cruelty has its place. He used to read the latter part of the book, with its really tragic if somewhat overemphasized account of the sorrow and despair of one who had himself lost what in others and the world he had most of it dearly valued. for the wonderful beauty that had so fascinated Basil Hallward, and many others besides him, seemed to never leave him, even those who had heard the most evil things against him, and from time to time strange rumours about his mode of life crept through London, and became the chatter of the clubs, could not believe anything to his dishonour when they saw. He had always the look of one who had kept himself unspotted from the world. Men who talked grossly became silent when Dorian Gray entered the room. There was something in the purity of his face that rebuked them. His mere presence seemed to recall to them the memory of the innocence that they had tarnished. They wondered how one so charming and graceful as he was could have escaped the stain of an age that was at once sordid and sensual. Often, on returning home from one of those mysterious and prolonged absences that gave rise to such strange conjecture among those who were his friends, or thought that they were so, he himself would creep upstairs to the lock, open the door and the key that never left him now, and stand with a mirror in front of the portrait that Basil Hallward painted of him, looking now at the evil and aging face of the canvas, now at the fair young face that laughed back from the polished glass. The very sharpness of the contrast used to quicken his sense of pleasure. He grew more and more enamored of his own beauty, more and more interested in the corruption of his own soul. He would examine with minute care, and sometimes with a monstrous, terrible delight, the hideous lines that seared the wrinkly forehead or crawled around the heavy, sensual mouth, wondering sometimes which were the more horrible, the signs of sin or the signs of age. He would place his white hands beside the coarse, bloated hands and smile. He mocked the misshapen body and the failing limbs. There were moments, indeed, at night, when lying sleepless in his own delicately scented chamber, or in the sordid room of the little ill-famed tavern near the docks, which under an assumed name and in disguise, it was his habit to frequent, he would think of the ruin he had brought upon his soul with a pity that was all the more poignant, because it was purely selfish. But moments such as these were rare. That curiosity about life which Lord Henry had first stirred in him, as they sat together in the garden of their friend, seemed to increase with gratification. The more he knew, the more he desired. The more he knew, the more he desired to know. He had mad hungers that grew more ravenous as he fed them. Yet he was not really reckless, at any rate in his relations with society. Once or twice every month during the winter, and on each Wednesday evening while the season lasted, he would throw open to the world his beautiful house, and have the most celebrated musicians of the day to charm his guests with the wonders of their art. His little dinner in the settling of which Lord Henry always assisted him, were noted as much for the careful selection and placing of those invited, as for the exquisite taste shown in the decoration of the table, with its subtle symphonic arrangements of exotic flowers, and embroidered cloth, and antique plate of gold and silver. Indeed, there were many, especially among the very young men, who saw or fancied that they saw. In Dorian Gray, the true realization of a type of which they had often dreamed in Eton or off Oxford days, a type that was to combine something of the real culture of the scholar with all the grace and manner of a citizen of the world. To them, he seemed to be of the company of those whom Dante describes as having sought to make themselves perfect by the worship. Like Gautier, he was one for whom the visible world existed, and certainly to him life itself was the first, greatest, of the arts, and for it all other art seemed to be but a preparation, fashion by which what is really fantastic becomes for a moment universal and dandyism, which in its own way is an attempt to assert the absolute modernity of beauty. Had, of course, their fascination for him. His mode of dressing and the particular styles that from time to time had their marked influence on the young exquisites of the Mayfair balls and Pall Mall Club windows, who copied him in everything that he did and tried to reduce the accidental charm of his graceful, though to him only half-serious foppery. For a while he was but too ready, to accept a position that was almost immediately offered to him on his coming of age, and found, indeed, a subtle pleasure in the thought that he might really be come to the London of his own day, what to imperial Neronian Rome the author of the Satricon once had been. Yet in his inmost heart, he desired to be something more than a mere arbiter elegantiarum. Elegantiarum. I really want to say it again. Arbiter elegantiarum. Okay. To be consulted on the wearing of a jewel, or the knotting of a necktie, or the conduct of a cane. He sought to elaborate some new scheme of life that would have its reasoned philosophy and its ordered principle, and find in the spiritualizing of the senses highest realization. The worship of the senses has often, and with much justice, been decried. Men feeling a natural instinct of terror about pains and sensation that seem stronger than themselves, and that they are conscious of sharing with the less highly organized forms of existence. But it appeared to Dorian Gray that the true nature of the senses had never been understood, and that they had remained savage and animal merely because the world had sought to starve them into submission or to kill them by pain, instead of aiming at making them elements of a new spirituality, of which a fine instinct for beauty was to be the dominant character. As he looked back upon man moving through his, he was haunted by a feeling of loss. So much had been surrendered, and to such little purpose. There had been willful rejection, monstrous forms of self-torture and self-denial, whose origin was fear and whose result was degradation infinitely more terrible. than the fancied degradation from which, in their ignorance, they had sought to escape. Nature, in her wonderful irony, driving out the Enchronite to feed with the wild animals of the desert and giving to the hermit the beasts of the field as his companions. Yes, there was to be, as Lord Henry prophesied, a new hedonism that was to recreate life and to save it from that harshly and calmly Puritanism that is having in our own day its curious revival. It was to have its service of the intellect, certainly, yet it was never to accept any theory or system that would involve sacrifice of any mode of passionate experience. Its aim, indeed, was to be experience itself, and not the fruits of experience, sweet or bitter as they might be, of the asceticism. Am I saying that right?
I guess so. Asceticism, asceticism, asceticism.
Asceticism. Of the asceticism that deadens the senses, as of the vulgar profligacy that dulls them. It was to know nothing, but it was to teach man to concentrate himself upon the moments of a life that itself but a moment. There are few of us who have not sometimes wakened before dawn, after one of those dreamless nights that makes us almost enamored of death. One of those nights, horror and misshapen joy, when through the chambers of the brain sweep phantoms more terrible than reality itself, and instinct with that vivid life that lurks in all grotesque, and that lends to Gothic art its enduring vitality. This art being, one might fancy, especially the art of those whose mind is troubled with the malady of reverie. Gradually white fingers creep to the curtain, and they appear to tremble. In black, fantastic shapes, dumb shadows crawl into the corners of the room, crouch there. Outside there is the stirring of birds and leaves, or the sound of men going forth to their work, or the sigh and the sob of the wind coming down from the hills, and wandering round the silent house, as though it feared to wake sleepers, and yet must needs call forth sleep from her purple cave. Veil after veil of thin dusky gauze is lifted, and by degrees the forms and colors of things are restored to them, and we watch the dawn remaking the world in antique pattern, the wan mirrors getting back their mimic light. The flameless tapers stand where we had left them, and beside them lies the half-cut book that we had been studying, or the wired flower that had been worn at the ball, or the letter that we had been afraid to read, or that we had read too often. Nothing seems to us changed. Out of the unreal shadows of the night comes back the real life that we had known. We have to resume it where we had left off. There steals over us a terrible sense of the necessity of the continuance of energy in the same wearisome round of stereotyped habit. For a wild longing it may be, that our eyelids might be opened some morning upon a world that had been refashioned anew in the darkness for our pleasure. A world in which things would have fresh shapes and colors and be changed, or have other secrets. A world in which past little or no place, or survive at any rate in no conscious form of obligation or regret. The remembrance even of joy having its bitterness in the memories of their pleasure and their pain. It was the creation of such worlds as these that seemed to Dorian Gray to be the true object, or amongst the true objects, and in search for sensation that would be at once new and delightful, possesses the element of strangeness that is so essential to romance. He would often adopt certain modes of thought that he knew to be really alien to his nature, abandon himself to their subtle influences, and then, having as it were caught their color and satisfied his intellectual curiosity, leaving them with that curious indifference that it is not compatible with a real ardor of temperament, and that indeed, according to certain modern psychology, is often a condition of it. It was rumored of him that once that he was about to join the Roman Catholic communion, and certainly the Roman ritual had always a great attraction, the daily sacrifice, more often, really, than all the sacrifices of the antique world, stirred him as much by its superb rejection of the evidence of sense as by the primitive simplicity of its elements and the eternal path of the human tragedy that it sought to simplify. He loved to kneel down on the cold marble pavement and watch the priest in his stiff flowered dalmatic, slowly and with white hands moving aside, and the veil of the tabernacle, or raising aloft the jeweled lantern-shaped monstrance with that pallid wafer that at times one would fain think is indeed the panis caelestis, the bread of angels, or robed in the garment of the Passion of Christ, breaking the host into the chalice, and smiting his breast for his sin. The fuming censers that gave ugh. The fuming censers that gave grave, oh my goodness. The fuming censers that grave boys, their lace and scarlet, tossed to the air like great gilt flowers, had their subtle fascination for him. As he passed out, he used to wonder at the black confession, and long to sit in the dim shadow of one of them, and listen to men and women whisper through the worn grating the true story of their lives. But he never fell into the error of arresting his intellectual development by any formal acceptance of creed or system, or of mistaking for a house in which to live, an inn that is suitable for the sojourn of a night, or for a few hours of a night in which there are no stars, and the moon is travail, mysticism, with his marvelous power of making common things strange, and the subtle antinomianism that always seemed to accompany it, moved him for a season. And for a season he inclined to the materialistic doctrine of the Darwinism movement in Germany, and found a curious pleasure in tracing the thought and passion of men to some pearly cell in some white nerve in the body, delighting in the conception of the absolute dependence of spirit on certain physical conditions, morbid or healthy, normal or deceased. Yet, as has been said of him before, No theory of life seemed to be of any importance compared. He felt keenly conscious of how barren all intellectual speculation, separated from action and experiment. He knew that the senses, no less than the soul, have their spiritual mysteries to reveal. And so he would now study perfume and the secrets of their manufacture, distilling heavily scented oils and burning odorous gums. He saw that there was no mood of the mind that had not its counterpart in the sensuous life, and set himself to discover the true relation, wondering what there was that made one mystic. And in ambergris that stirred one's passion, and in violets that woke the memory of dead romance, and in musk that troubled brain, and in champagne that stained the imagination. In seeking often to elaborate a real psychology of perfume, and to estimate the several influences of sweet-smelling roots, scented, pollen-laden flowers, of aromatic balm, and of dark and fragrant woods, spikenard, that sickens of Havigny, that makes men mad, and of aloe, that are said to be able to expel melancholy from the soul. At another time he devoted himself entirely to music, and in a long latticed room, with a vermilion and gold ceiling and walls of olive green lacquer, he used to give curious concerts in which mad gypsies pour wild music, little zither, or grave, yellow-shawled Tunisian, plucked strained strings of monstrous, while grinning negroes beat monotonous upon copper drums, and crouching upon scarlet slim turbaned Indians blew through long pipes of reed or brass, charm or fade. Charm great hooded snake, horrible adder, the harsh intervals and shrill barbaric stirred at time and Schubert's grace, and Chopin, beautiful sorrow, and the mighty harmonies of Beethoven himself fell unheeded on his ear. He collected together from all parts of the world the strangest instruments that could be found, either in the tombs of dead nations or among the savage tribes that have survived contact with Western civilization, and love to touch and try and try them. Sorry. He had the mysterious Drew Paris of the Rio Negro, India, that women are not allowed to look at, and that even youth may not see till they have been subjected to fasting and scourging. And the earthen jars of the Peruvians that have the shrill cries of birds, and the flute of human bones such as Alfonso del Oval heard in Chile, and the sonorous green jaspers that are found near Cusco, and give forth a note of singular sweetness. He had painted gourds filled with pebbles that rattled when they were shaken, the long clarinet of the Mexicans into which the former does not blow, but through which he inhales the air, the harsh pure of the Amazon tribes that is sounded by the sentinels, who sit all day long in high trees and can be heard. It is said at a distance of 3 leagues, the Teponaztli that has 2 vibrating tongues of wood and is beaten with sticks that are smeared with elastic gum, obtain the milky juice of plants. The yotl bells of the Aztec that are hung in clusters like grapes, and a huge cylindrical drum covered with the skins of great, like the one that Bernal Diaz saw when he went with Cortez into the Mexican temple, and of whose doleful sound he has left us. So vivid a description. The fantastic character of these instruments fascinated him, and he felt curious delight in the thought that art, like nature, has her monsters, things of bestial shape, and with hideous voices. Yet, after some time, he wearied of them, and would sit in his box at the opera, either alone or with Lord Henry, listening to rapt pleasure on Hauser, and seeing in the prelude to that great work of art a presentation of the tragedy of his own soul. On one occasion he took up the study of jewels, and appeared at a poston ball as un de Joyeuse, Admiral of France, in a dress covered with 560 pearls. This taste enthralled him for years, and indeed may be said never to have left. He would often spend a whole day settling and resettling in their cases the various stones he had collected, such as the olive green, chrysoberyl. Does that sound right?
Yeah, as good as it can be.
Okay. Such as the olive green chrysoberyl that turns red by lamplight. The cymophane, with its wire-like line of silver, the pistachio-colored peridot, rose pink and wine yellow topazes, carbuncles of fiery scarlet with tremulous four-rayed stars, flame red cinnamons arranged in violet spinels, amethysts, with their alternate layers of ruby and sapphire. He loved the red gold of the stone, and the moonstone's pearly whiteness, and the broken rainbow of the milky opal. He procured from Amsterdam 3 emeralds of extraordinary size and richness of colour, and had a turquoise de la Vieille. He had a turquoise de la Vieille brooch that was the envy of all connoisseurs. He discovered wonderful stories also about jewels. In Afonso's Clericalis Disciplina, a serpent was mentioned with eyes of real jacinth, and in the romantic history of Alexander, the conqueror of Amathia, was said to have found in the Vale of Jordan snakes, with collars of real emeralds growing on their. There was a gem in the brain of the dragon. Philostratus told us, and by the exhibition of gold letters and a scarlet robe, the monster could be thrown into a magical sleep and slain. According to the great alchemist Pierre de Boniface, the diamond rendered invisible, and the agate of India made him eloquent. The cornelian appeased anger, and the hyacinth provoked sleep, and the amethyst drove away the fumes of wine. the garnet cast out demons, and the hydropicus deprived the moon of her color. The selenite waxed and waned with the moon, and the Melchius that discovers thieves could be affected only by the blood of kid. Leonardo Camillus had seen a white stone taken from the brain of a newly killed toad. It was a certain antidote against poison. The bazaar that was found in the heart of the Arabian deer was a charm that could cure the plague. In the nests of Arabian birds, aspalates, that, according to Democritus, kept the wearer from any danger by fire. King of Selen rode through a city with a large ruby in it. As a ceremony of the coronation, the gates of the palace of John the priest were made of sardine, with the horn of the horned snake in rock, so that no man might bring poison within. Over the gable were 2 golden apples in which were 2 carbuncles, so that the gold might shine by day and the carbuncles by night. In Lodge's strange romance, a Marguerite of America, it was stated in the chamber of the queen one could behold all the ladies of the world in chased out silver, looking through bare mirror of chrysolite, carbuncle, sapphire, and green emerald. Marco Polo had seen the inhabitants of Zipangu Place, rose-colored pearls in the mouths of the dead. A sea monster had been enamored of the pearl that the diver brought to King Croesus, and had slain the thief, and had mourned for 7 moons over its loss. When the Huns lured the king into the great pit, he flung it away. Procopius tells the story, nor was it ever found. Though the Emperor Anastasius offered his 500 weight gold pieces for it. The king of Malabar had shown to a certain Venetian a rosary of 304 pearls, one for every god that he worshipped. When the Duke de Valentinois, son of Alexander is that sixth? Okay. Visited Louis the 12th
Mhm.
of France. His horse was loaded with gold leaves, according to Barenton, and his cap. Oh my gosh. Oh. And his cap had double rows of rubies that had thrown out a great light. Charles of England had ridden in stirrups, hung with 421 diamonds. Richard II had a coat, valued at 30,000 marks, which was covered with balanced rubies. Paul described Henry the Eighth?
Mhm.
Henry VIII on his way to the tower previous to his coronation, as wearing a jacket of raised gold, the placard embroidered with diamonds and the others, and a great border right about his neck, large balasses. About the favorites of James I wore earrings of emerald set in gold filigree. Edward II gave to Piers Gaveston a suit of red armour, studded with jacinth, collar of gold roses, set with turquoise stones, and a skull-cap parsemé. Henry II wore jewelled gloves reaching to the elbow, and had a hot glove sewn with 12 rubies and 52 great orient. The ducal hat of Charles the Rash, the last Duke of Burgundy, was hung with pear-shaped pearls studded with sapphire. How exquisite life had once been! How gorgeous in its pomp and decoration! Even to read of the luxury of the dead was wonderful. Then he turned his attention to embroideries and to the tapestries that formed the office of frescoes in the chill rooms of the northern nations of Europe. As he investigated the subject, and he always had an extraordinary faculty of becoming absolutely absorbed for the moment in whatever he got, he had almost saddened by the reflection of the ruin time brought on beautiful and wonderful things. He, at any rate, had escaped. Summer followed summer, and the yellow jonquils bloomed and died many times, and nights of horror repeated the story of their shame. But he was unchanged. No, winter marred his face or stained his flower-like bloom. How different it was with material things. Where had they passed? Where was the great crock-coloured robe, on which the gods fight against giants, that had been worked by brown girls for the pleasure of Athena? Where the huge velarium Negro had stretched across the Colosseum,
Nero?
that Titan sail.
Nero? Did you say Nero or
Oh
Nero?
my god. I said
Yeah.
where the huge velarium that Nero stretched across the Colosseum, that Titan sail of purple, on which was represented starry sky, the Apollo driving chariot drawn by white gill-trained steeds. He longed to see the curious table napkins wrought for the priest of the sun, on which were displayed on the dainties and viands that wanted for a feast. The mortuary cloth of King Chilperic, with its 300 golden beads, and the fantastic robes that excite the indignation of the Bishop of Pontus, and were figured with lions, panthers, bears, dogs, forests, rock hunters, all in fact that a painter can copy from nature. And the coat that Charles of Orleans once wore, on the sleeves of which embroidered the verses of a song beginning Madame, je suis tout joyeux, the musical accompaniment of the words being wrought in gold thread, and each note of square shape in those days, formed with 4 pearls. He read of the room that was prepared at the palace at Reims for the use of Queen Joan of Burgundy, and was decorated with 1,321 made embroidery and blazoned with the king's arms, and 561 butterflies, whose wings were similarly ornamented with the arms of the queen, the whole worked in gold. Catherine de Medici had a mourning bed made for her of black velvet powdered with crescents and sun. Its curtains were of damask, with leafy wreaths and garlands, figured upon a gold and silver ground, and fringed along edges with embroideries, pearls, and stood in a room hung with rows of the queen's devices in cut black velvet upon the silver. Oh my god. Oh, how do I read it?
Mm-hmm.
Is this 16? No.
14.
14?
Yeah.
Louis XIV had gold embroidered caryatides 15 feet high in his apartment. The state bed of Sobieski, king of Poland, was made of Smyrna gold brocade embroidered in turquoise, with verses from Quran. Its supports were of silver gilt, beautifully chased, profusely set with enameled and jeweled medallions. It had been taken from the Turkish camp before Vienna, and the standard of Mohammed had stood beneath the tremulous gilt of its canopy. And so for a year he sought to accumulate the most exquisite specimen that he could find of textile and embroidered work, getting the dainty Delhi muslins finely wrought gold, thread palmates, and stitched over with iridescent beetle wings. The Dhaka gauzes that from their transparency are known in the East as woven air and running water. And evening dew, strange figured clothes from Java, elaborated yellow Chinese hanging, books bound in tawny satin or fair blue silks, and wrought silver with fleur-de-lis, birds and images, veils of lace, worked in Hungary point, Sicilian brocade, and stiff Spanish velvet, Georgian work with its gilt coin, and Japanese fukosos with their green-toned gold and their marvelous plumaged bird. He had a special passion also for ecclesiastical vestments, as indeed he had for everything connected with the service of the church, in the long cedar chests that lined the west gallery of his house. He had stored away many rare and beautiful specimens, for is really the raiment of the bride of who must wear purple and jewels and fine linen that she may hide the pallid macerated body that is worn by the suffering that she seeks for and wounded by self-inflicted pain. He possessed a gorgeous coat of crimson silk and gold thread damask, figured with a repeating pattern of golden pomegranates set in six-petaled forms of blossoms. Six-petaled formal blossom. Beyond on either side was pineapple device wrought to seed pearls. The orpheries were divided into panels representing scenes from the life of Virgin. The coronation of the Virgin was figured in colored silks upon the hood. This was Italian work of the 15th century. Another cope was of velvet, embroidered with heart-shaped groups of acanthus leaves, from which spread long-stemmed white, the details of which picked out with silver thread and colored. The Moorish bore a seraph's head in gold thread raised. The orpheries were woven in a diaper of red and gold silk, and were starred with medallions of many saints, and among whom was Saint Sebastian. He had suples, also of amber-colored silk, and the blue and gold brocade, and the yellow damask and cloth of gold, figured with representations of the Passion and Crucifixion of Christ, and embroidered with lions and peacocks and other emblems. Dalmatics of white satin and pink silk damask, decorated with tulips and dolphins and fleur-de-lis. Altar frontals of crimson velvet, blue linen, and many corpses. Chalice veils and sudaria in the mystic offices into which things were put. There was something that quickened his imagination. For these treasures and everything that he collected, the lovely house, were to be to him means of forgetfulness, modes by which he could escape. For a season, for the fear that seemed to be at times to be almost too great to be borne. Upon the walls of the lonely locked room where he had spent so much of his boyhood, had hung with his own hands a terrible portrait whose changing features showed him the real degradation of his life, and in front of it had draped purple and gold pall as a curtain. For a week he would not go there. He would forget the hideous painted thing, and get back his light heart, his wonderful joyousness, his passionate absorption in mere existence. And suddenly, some night, he'd creep out of the house, go to dreadful places near Bluegate Fields, and stay there, day after day, until he was driven away. On his return, he would sit in front of the picture, sometimes loathing it and himself, but filled, at other times, with that pride of individualism that is half the fascination of sin, and smiling with a secret pleasure at the misshapen shadow that had to bear the burden that should have been his own. After a few years, he could not endure to be long out of England, and gave up the villa that he had shared at Trouville with Lord Henry, as well as the white-walled inn-house Algiers, where they had more than once spent the winter. He had hated to be separate from the picture, which was such a part of his life, and was also afraid that during his absence someone might gain access to the room. In spite of the elaborate bars that he had caused to be placed upon the door, he was quite conscious that this would tell him nothing. It was true, the portrait still preserved, under all the foulness and ugliness of the face, its marked likeness to himself. But what could they learn from it? He would laugh at anyone who tried to taunt him. He had not painted. What was it to him how vile and full of shame it looked? Even if he told them, would they believe it? Yes, yet he was afraid. Sometimes when he was down at his great house in Nottinghamshire, entertaining the fashionable young men of his own rank, who were his chief companions, and astounding the county by the wanton luxury and gorgeous splendour of his mode of life, he would suddenly leave his guests and rush back to town to see that the door had not been tampered with, and that the picture was still there. What if it should be stolen? The mere thought made him cold with horror. Surely the world would know his secret then. Perhaps the world had already suspected it. For a while he fascinated many that were not few who distrusted him. He was very nearly blackballed at a West End club of which his birth and social position fully entitled him to become a member. It was said that on one occasion he was brought by a friend into the smoking room of the Churchill. The Duke of Berwick and another gentleman got up in a marked manner and went out. Curious stories became current about him after he passed away. No, after he had passed the 25th year. It was rumored that he had been seen brawling with foreign sailors in a low den in the distant parts of Whitechapel, that he consorted with thieves and coiners and knew the mysteries of their trade. His extraordinary absences became notorious, and when he used to reappear again in society, men would whisper to each other in corners, or pass him with a sneer, or look at him with cold, searching eyes, as though they were determined to discover his secret. Such insolences and attempted slight he of course took no notice, and in the opinion of most people, his frank debonair manner, his charming boyish smile, and the infinite grace of that wonderful youth that seemed to never leave him, were in themselves a sufficient answer to the calumny. For so they termed them. They were circulated about. It was remarked, however, some of those who had been so intimate with him appeared, after a time, to shun him. Women who had wildly adored him for his sake had braved all social censure and set convention at defiance, were seen to grow pallid with shame or horror if Dorian Gray entered the. Yet these whispered scandals only increased in the eyes of many his strange and dangerous charm. His great wealth uh, was a certain element of security. Civilized society at least, is never very ready to believe anything detriment of those who are both rich and fascinating. It feels instinctively that manners are of more importance than moral, and its opinion the highest responsibility of much less value than possession of a good chef. And after all, it is a very poor consolation told that the man who has given one a bad dinner or poor wine is irreproachable in his private life. Even the cardinal virtues cannot atone for the half-cold entrees, as Lord Henry remarked once in discussion on the subject, and there is possibly a good deal to be said for his view. For the canons of good society are, or should be, the same as the canons of art. Form is absolutely essential to it. It should have the dignity of ceremony, as well as its unreality, and should combine the insincere character of a romantic play with the wit and beauty that make such play delightful. Is insincerity such a terrible thing? I think it is merely a method by which we multiply our. Such, at any rate, was Dorian Gray's opinion. He used to wonder at the shallow psychology of those who conceive ego in man as a thing simple, permanent, reliable, and of one essence. To him, man was a being with myriad lives and myriad sensations, complex, multiform culture that bore within itself strange legacies of thought and passion, and whose very flesh was tainted with the monstrous maladies of death. He loved to stroll through the gaunt, cold picture gallery of his country house, and look at the various portraits of those whose blood flowed in his veins. Here was Philip Herbert, described by Francis Osborne in his memoirs on the reigns of the Queen Elizabeth and King James, as one who was caressed by the court for his hands and face, kept him not long company. Was it Herbert's life that he sometimes led? Had strange poisonous germ crept from body to body, till it had reached his own? Was it some dim sense of that ruined grace that made him so suddenly, and almost without cause, give utterance in Basil Hallward's studio to the mad prayer that had so changed his life? Here in gold-embroidered red doublet, jewelled surcoat, and gilt-edged ruff and wristband, and Sir Anthony Shepherd, or Sherard, Sir Anthony Sherard, with his silver and black armour proud at his feet. What had this man's legacy had been? Had the lover of Giovanna of Naples bequeathed him some inheritance of sin and shame? Were his own action merely the dreams that the dead man had dare not realize? Here on the fading canvas smiled Elizabeth Devereux, in her gauze hood, pearl stomacher, and his pink slash sleeves. A flower was in her right hand, and her left clasped an enamel collar of white and damask roses. On a table by her side lay a mandolin and an apple. There were large green rosettes upon her little pointed shoes. He knew her life, and the strange stories they were told about her lover. He had something of her temperament in him. These oval, heavy-lidded eyes seemed to look curiously at him. What of George Willoughby, with his powdered hair and fantastic patches? How evil he looked! His face was such saturnine and swarthy, and the sensual lips seemed to be twisted with disdain. Delicate lace ruffles fell over the lean yellow hands that were so overladen with rings. He had been a macaroni of the 18th century, and the friend in his youth of Lord Ferrers. What of the second Beckenham, the company of the Prince Regent in his wildest days? Oh my God. The companion of the Prince Regent in his wildest days, and one of the witnesses at the secret marriage with Mrs. Fitzherbert. How proud and handsome, with his chestnut curls and insolent pose. What passions had he bequeathed? The world had looked upon him as infant. He had led the orgies at Carlton House. Oh, dang. Star of the Garter glittered upon him. Beside him hung the portrait of his wife, a pallid, thin-lipped woman, and her blood also stirred within him. How curious it all seemed. And his mother with her Lady Hamilton face and her moist wine-dashed lips. He knew what he had got from her. He had got from her his beauty, and his passion for the beauty of others. She laughed at him in her loose becante dress. There were vine leaves in her. The purple spilled from the cup she was holding. The carnations of the painting had withered, but the eyes were still wonderful in their depth and brilliancy of color. They seemed to follow him wherever he went. Yet one had ancestors in literature as well as in one's own race. Nearer perhaps in type and temperament, many of them, and certainly with an influence of which one was more absolutely conscious. There were at times when it appeared to Dorian that the whole history was merely the record of his own life, not as he had lived it in fact, in act, in circumstance, but as his imagination had created it for him. as it had been in his brain and in his passions. He felt that he had known them all. Those strange, terrible figures that had passed across the stage of and made sin so marvelous and evil so full of subtlety. It seemed to him that in some mysterious way of their lives had been his own. The hero of the wonderful novel that had so influenced him had himself known the curious. In the 7th chapter he tells, crowned with laurel, lest lightning might strike him, he had sat as Tiberius.
Tiberius.
Oh my God, Tiberius. In a garden at Capri, reading the shameful book of Elephantis, while dwarfs and peacocks strutted around him, and the flute player mocked the swinger of the censer, and as Caligula had caroused with the green-shirted jockey in their stable, and supped in an ivory manger with a jewel front-letted horse, and as Domitian had wandered through a corridor lined with marble mirrors, looking round with haggard eyes for the reflection of the dagger that was to end his days, and sick with that ennui, with that terrible tedium vitae that comes on those to whom life denies nothing, and had peered through a clear emerald at the red shambles of the circus, and then a litter of pearl and purple drawn by silver-shod mules, been carried through the streets of pomegranates to a house of gold, and heard men cry on Nero Caesar as he passed by, and as Elagabalus Elagabalus had painted his face with colours, and plied with the staff among the women, and brought the moon from Carthage, and given her in mystic marriage to the sun. Over and over again, Dorian used to read this fantastic chapter, and the 2 chapters immediately following, which, as in some curious tapestries, or cunningly wrought enamels, were pictured the awful and beautiful forms of whom vice and blood and weariness had made monstrous or mad. Filippo, Duke of Milan, who slew his wife and painted her lips scarlet poison, that her lover might suck death from the dead thing he fondled. Pietro Barbi, the Venetian, known as Paul II, sought in his vanity to assume the title of Formosus, and whose tiara valued 200,000 florins, was bought at the price of a terrible sin. Gian Maria Visconti, who used hounds to chase living men, and whose murdered body was covered by roses, harlot who had loved the Borgia on his white horse, with fratricide riding beside him, and his mantle stained with the blood of Perotto. Pietro Riario, the young Cardinal Archbishop of Florence, child and minion of Sixtus IV, whose beauty was equalled only by Debac, and who received Leonora of Aragon in a pavilion of white and crimson silk, filled with nymphs and centaurs, and gilded a boy that he might serve at least as Ganymede or Hylas, Ezelin, whose melancholy could be cured only by a spectacle of death, and who had a passion of red blood, as other men have for red wine. The son of the fiend, as was reported, and one who had cheated his father at dice and gambling with him for his own soul, Giambattista Cibo, who in mockery took the name of innocent, and in those torpid veins the blood of 3 lads was infused by a Jewish doctor, Sigismondo Malatesta, the lover of Isolta, and the Lord Rimini, whose effigy was burned at Rome, at the enemy of God and man, who strangled Polyssena with an apple, and gave poison to Ginevra d'Este in a cup of emerald, and in honor of a shameful passion, built a pagan church, Christian worship. Charles V, who had so wildly adored his brother's wife that a leper had warned him of the insanity that was coming on him, and who, when his brain had sickened and grown strange, could be soothed by Saracen cards, painted with the images of love and death and madness, and in his trimmed jerkin and jewelled cap, and thus-like curls, Griffonetto Belgioni, who slew Store, with his bride, and Simonetto, with his page, and whose comeliness was such that, as he lay dying in the yellow piazza of Perugia, those who had hated him could not choose but weep, and Atalanta, who had cursed him, blessed him. There was a horrible fascination in them all. He saw them at night, and they troubled his imagination in the day. The Renaissance, the Renaissance knew of strange manners of poisoning by helmet, and a lighted torch, by embroidered glove, and a jewelled fan, by a gilded pomander, and by an amber chain. Dorian Gray had been poisoned, but there were moments when he looked on evil simply as a mode through which he could realize his conception of the beautiful.
Man,
Oh God.
That was a
that was
long
a
ass
long
chapter.
chapter.
Oh God, I'm out of breath.
The recording's like an hour. A little over an
Oh
hour.
God. Oh, I was dying out. Could you tell?
A little bit,
Shivers.
yeah. Yeah.
I was trying not to look at how many pages I had left because it was discouraging me. I was like, oh God. In my head, I was like, I'm not gonna make it, guys. I don't think I'm gonna make it.
Yeah, I was just like, I don't want to interrupt her. She's got a good thing going. She's going. She's going.
I didn't realize how many pages they were until like a few pages in. And I was like, whoa, damn.
With no dialogue, too. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was a long
Crazy.
chapter.
Yeah. It was.
It was a long chapter filled with nothing.
Mm-hmm.
They're just going into like what fantasies Dorian Gray had while he grew up.
Yeah. I or yeah, I don't know. I honestly I had a hard time keeping up because of like it kind of felt like a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't feel like a lot of that information contributed so much to the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it was just more information about Dorian and how he thinks now.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's pretty rough.
Yeah. Dang.
Ooh, what a chapter to come back to.
Mm-hmm. How are you feeling, Kelsey?
Good.
Dang. That was so long.
Still recovering.
Oh, yeah.